So, our first speaker is Ramon Alberch. Thank you very much, Ramon, for being here. He accepted our invitation right away after checking his agenda because he is very busy. He lives between Catalonia, South America. He is very well known in the archives field beyond having had different positions in Barcelona City Council, Girona City Council. He's been the deputy director of the Catalonia archives system. He's been one of the main promoters of the renovation of Catalan archives. Thanks to him, we are up to date here in Catalonia in terms of archives management. He is the coordinator of the working group on cultural dynamization of the Latin American Association of Archivists, and many more things could be said about him and his contribution to archives. He has been also working in the field of memory and archives, human rights and archives, to name a few. These are only a few of the areas in which he is working. And without further ado, Ramon, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Hello and good morning. Thank you very much, Pilar. Let me check the time. So please, you can tell me off when I have 5 minutes left only. Hello and good morning to one and all. I am very pleased to be at MNAC, and I am very pleased and humbled for your invitation, dear colleagues of Picasso Museum and MNAC, Pilar and Silvia, and your team, and Jorge Velasco as well. I believe that this conference is very timely, and this is why it's been so successful. The topic we're dealing with is gaining importance in archives management. In the past, our task was focused on different things, but today, as professionals, we shall try and respond to the new challenges. I cannot speak about today's archives. One must know one's limits, but perhaps I can share a few remarks or ideas about polyhedral archives and plural contents. This text aims to reflect about a few concepts which are very important to me, and I will focus on some specific examples that could apply to any other case, but from my perspective this will help understanding the idea of archives as being polyhedral. Archives are multifaceted, they are not monolithic, and oftentimes the outcome of our research efforts depends on our attitude, on our gaze. Documents speak depending on the questions you answer them and depending on your professionalism. So here's an image of the International Council of Archives by Deo Janus, who has the virtue of looking into the past and looking into the future at the same time. When the ICA was founded in 1948, the founding members believed that we focus on the management of history and documental heritage. So archives as being polyhedral is very important. Then there's a second idea, which is that documents can be read from different perspectives and angles. So in this sense, the attitude of researchers matters. There's another topic that has been widely debated, which has to do with the concept and the borders of archives. I've been in the field for 40 years, so now I can look back, like Eric and so many others who have been working in this field for quite a long time. In Catalonia, we went through a reaffirmation process, the development of the profession. We marked our or a certain distance with other professionals like IT professionals, documentalists, etc. We went through an identification process because we felt weak, and we had the feeling that if we were wide open, we would be, let's say, trapped by others. So we have gone through an identity reaffirmation process, a methodological development process. We have set the boundaries of our profession, and that was logical back then, historically speaking, but today it would make no sense to differentiate ourselves from others. Today we are a recognized science with a recognized methodology. There's even academic training in the field, so we shall not be afraid of outside enemies. So in the last few years, we must acknowledge that one of the main challenges that we face in the field is what I call, and I have debated this with friends and colleagues, the multiple interdisciplinarity of the profession, of the job. So far from becoming weaker, any action that we implement in cooperation with any other professionals, art, artists, etc., well, instead of weakening us, this reinforces us. We know that archives cannot be explained in a simple manner. An architect builds homes, a doctor saves lives, a teacher teaches, whereas an archivist does not only archive. And this is why our profession is complex and grand. And this is why we have this holistic and heterogeneous personality. This is a space that very few jobs can claim. We have a very complex job, and at the same time we are open to the most groundbreaking developments. We have debated that with many different colleagues. So today there's blockchain, data mining, AI, quality, e-signature, etc. We are open, we are wide open to all new developments. So borders have disappeared. Today we must be open to any new development, and of course we need to interact with as many stakeholders as possible beyond the traditional stakeholders that we've had in the past. When working in a more historic field, we would work with historians, journalists, IT experts, organization managers, human rights activists, legal experts, etc. So everything was clearly defined. There was a certain plurality in the stakeholders we interacted with, but this has changed radically because the scenario is very wide, and so are the possibilities ahead. As our colleagues yesterday mentioned, yesterday's presentations were amazing. So considering the high level of the panel, I thought that I had to share with you a short conceptual reflection, and at the same time I wanted to speak about the polyhedral archives and how this can be, let's say, interpreted from a practical perspective. I've sent my presentation to a few colleagues and I asked them to give me feedback. I came up with a few conclusions, but I got rid of many of the ideas that I wanted to share with you. And now I have 5 ideas. 1. Archives as secret and power space. Archives as repositories of new memories. Archives and insignificant documents. And I will tell you more about why I speak about insignificant documents. Archives as literary and cinema objects. Now we are the object of cinema and literature. And last, archives as the outcome of recreation and reconstruction processes. My friends always say that my PowerPoints are boring, but today I have included many different images, so much so that it was too heavy and I couldn't send it. Archives as environments of power and secrecy. This is a classical symbolism. Ketalar, Eric have already spoken about this idea, but I'm particularly interested in this. It's a very powerful narrative, right? Information, the incredible power of information, documents understood as power, who holds information holds power. But sometimes it's difficult to ground this idea, and I like grounding it in a bodily perspective. How can power gain, let's say, corporeity? There are four fields, the chest of the three keys in the medieval times, a chest that had three keys. So in order to open it, you needed three different individuals: the municipal power, the representative of different estimates. But there are chests composed by three keys, four keys, and in Andorra they have 7 keys because they have 7 provinces, and in each province there's 1 key. And when it was about having access to an important document, the principals of the 7 provinces had to attend a meeting. And if someone did not show up, the person had to be summoned. And of course, in Girona, many times the police had to go chase one of the key holders. The king was the one that was the only person. Well, it's also called privileged archives. There were chests which hosted documents and money. And then there's the 3 key cabinets, safes where documents are locked, and it was almost impossible to have access to documents. So there one would hide secrets in an inaccessible manner with very limited access only by a minority, or holding documents in sacred venues. Barcelona City Council, for example, used Santa Caterina convent, but then the boxes, the chests, were transferred to San Francisco convent, but because there had been like a competences conflict back then, it was very difficult to split competences between the state and the church. And this has an incredible end. The foundational documents of Barcelona City Council state that San Francisco Convent Barcelona City Council had to build the San Jaume headquarters, the Consell de Cent headquarters, but the documents were never recovered. And when someone said we should recover the funding documents, the answer was, it's alright, they are in a sacred place in the convent, no one will dare destroying them. A few years after, desamortization started, and then these documents were transferred to Aragon. And today, well, this is a very sensitive topic. I was almost killed when I was the deputy director for raising the topic. So there, the 1,000 documents, funding documents of Barcelona City Council are in the headquarters of the Aragon Crown and not in the Barcelona City Council archive, which, by the way, is top, because it was considered that if documents were withheld in a sacred environment, nothing would happen. And see, it hasn't been the case. And fortified enclosures, the Simancas Castle, is a paradigm of this. Incredible, with a bridge in Valladolid. So again, José Luis Rodríguez de Diego has published many different articles on the topic, very interesting ones. The king, in order to underline that, the fact that his archives were in Simanca, Well, that gave a special relevance to the archives. Well, advised by his environment, he would open the archive to the most distinguished subjects. And this was only because if one day they suffered an attack, the subjects would be interested in defending the castle. One can consider this as an opening to the archives to other sectors, but in fact this is a way to reinforce the privileged status quo. Here we have an image of Tortosa. Jesus Mazip, the late Jesus Mazip, had the idea to bring the documents back to this cabinet. Principle of precedence, principle of primitive order, back to the cabinet. I believe this is a quite radical interpretation of both principles. But there we go, an amazing cabinet, amazing box.
I have chosen a simple one. This is a 3-key chest from Villa Borja. And you can see them here, the 3 locks. You have to open them all. And here's where jewels were kept, and sometimes in some occasions mixed up with money and things like that. And in cases of Barcelona, Madrid, they were separating the chest of privileges and the chest of monies. Second element, the archive is repository of the new memory. Archives have always been tempted to go beyond Anas Pilar, Girona, Generalitat. As everyone says, using different characters in institutions, associations, if we only keep our own funds in the institution, it will be an officialistic story, very marked by one perspective, and in order to open up the story, especially in terms of municipal archives, the most sensitive to this reality, have widened very clearly the provenance of their funds, making plural funds possible. But there was the second leap made, which was the capturing and processing of community funds. This has happened a lot, especially in Colombian human rights. I've been working a lot of that. The communities of Cauca, wherever, who attacked by the armed forces in Colombia, the FARC, or some others, were forced to document these massacres, and they have photographies, videos, written documents, correspondence. So it's a very not very orthodox archive. It's rather a new perspective on this all. And this perspective leaps forward, which is what some people now call social archive movement. I have said that this was born in America because this is how it started, and it's here to stay. We talked a lot about blockchain, and now we speak less of it. And I think that this is an idea that is here to stay. So what are the theoretical foundations of the social archive? Firstly, the conviction that the documentary legacy needs to be more plural and a reflection of society. And this is related to a debate that we won't have, which is appraisal. We were very much concerned about preserving those things that could be of interest for researchers in the future, more in the lines of taxonomic appraisal, as we were saying yesterday, but not the functional appraisal. Let's preserve those things that are significant now, because this is what researchers in the future can use. So questioning on structures and types of documents, and don't ask esoteric questions. So who thought that the church registries would be so important for the history of demography, of whatever you wish? or that an apparent notarial contract or agreement should see the maybe deeds of an artist or would be related to that. So anyway, let's try and preserve those things that explain nowadays society. Let's not ask questions, because the investigator or researcher in the future will apply the proper use to these things. The consideration that the information of social networks, especially Twitter, are constitutes part of the memory and history of humanity. Lots of things are being said there, and also that all this gathering of information in social media collects information from communicators, journalists, activists, sociologists, etc., 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 librarians, archivists. We can no longer work on our own. It's the syndrome of the bullfighter archivist. Normally, the bullfighter just goes like this, and he tells others to leave him alone. Just leave me alone, and he proves how bold and brave he is. That's the bullfighter, yes? An archivist has had this syndrome of the bullfighter archivist. Please leave me alone. I'm going to solve this on my own. And far from this syndrome, we should open up to many other professions in a mandatory fashion and because of conviction. And social archives as well should be looked at from this perspective. This idea of the social archives does not want to substitute or replace the current model, but rather enrich omnipresent information and that archives have traditionally collected. And finally, transform ephemeral messages in information for the future. And from the professional perspective, we need to move from being passive receivers to active capturers. So this is one more subject in our pending or to-do list, which is to capture this information. There's lots of references. The most important one is the Documenting the Now by the University of Washington, the University of California, and the Maryland Institute for Technologies and the Humanities, and the Mellon Foundation. But the list is very long. The British Library, the NARA, the US Congress Library, National Archives, and many of them have seen that apart from the traditional archive collection, like a puzzle putting different parts together, there's a new trigger. The trigger is the American Society of Archivists, the meeting in 2014 with the death of Michael Brown, the 18-year-old African-American Michael Brown, at the hands of the police in Ferguson. Then there's John Floyd, a very clear case as well, George Floyd in Powderhorn, reinforced the desire to collect this information. There's this witness showing on tutorials how to video record different actions that we believe unfair with enough credibility in order to take this to a court, and that this should be considered as evidence before a court. So, in the case of Michael Brown, this is very clear. The case of George Floyd as well, and where we saw the ruling with the video recording that was accepted as evidence a few days ago. It was shown on TV that some policemen were also attacking a black male person, and they see that someone is recording them, and they let him go very quickly because they saw that this was evidence that could take them to court. So there's this movement as well. This has gone much beyond the reaction in the case of racism regarding inventory, projects that have covered projects from the social network. One is the project Cuéntalo on sexual abuse, of women, reaching the capture and categorization of 160,000 tweets. Noting por on the terrorist attack on Rambles de Barcelona on the 17th of August 2017. The referendum on 1st of October 2017, with the independence of Catalonia, with the participation of 100 archives that collected 8 million tweets and graphic and audiovisual testimonies of the voting and police action beyond the usual political process so that this phenomenon could be analyzed. 2 million people mobilizing to go and vote. And case was the terrorist attack at the station of Atocha in March 2014. A memorial was created, and there was the archive created as well related to this. There's lots of initiatives that have been embedded, or they have been embedded in the social fabric, and some societies have this as an element of their own activity to enrich the information and collect many different things. This is one of the 5,000 documents collected in La Rambla with the attack. This is a girl from Olesa in Montserrat. We are all Barcelona. I love you, Barcelona. I am not afraid. I am a witness. And lots of these are just stains, basically, of the candles placed on top. And well, the museum and the archive coordinated to keep this. It was restored, and it is a way of understanding a phenomenon that is a popular phenomenon, sentiment, people responding, drawing or rating things. So what is the problem of the social archive and this digital memory and the recovery of information from the network? It's a huge cost. We know how expensive digital memory is. There was the hard disk. There used to be a hard disk or floppy disks before. And one day with an appraisal committee, we thought, you don't need to destroy anything, we will just keep everything in our computers. Well, that's ignorance and naive, basically, but they were not listening to us or what we were saying anyway. And then there's the digital memory, which has very high costs, and the other one, I think the name is Charles Richard Ovenden, would suggest a special tax for big companies. It is true that museums are the memorizing institutions that are called to save this, so they should be paying a tax for this. Richard Ovenden, and the book is To Burn Archives, and the proposal is to create a tax, as I was saying, because the costs are basically out of any type of possible scope. There's also the insignificant documents. Sometimes we believe that many documents can be done away with, and it is true that archiving has developed a technique for the processing of documents, but amongst our pending subjects, I think there's two that we have not solved. One is the long-term digital preservation. We have still serious problems to guarantee that the documents will be accessible in 150 years as well as original because of migration, format conversion, etc. But appraisal is one of the things. We're still fluctuating between the classical appraisal of primary and secondary values and the functional macro appraisal, but we still have not focused or have a method that will prevent us from making mistakes, obvious mistakes. So what does this mean? The importance of identifying sets of documents that, despite their simplicity, they hide very strong potential. So there's no innocent documents, and we need to rethink the appraisal methods, and we need to think about the context of production when the document had a value and a use. What relationship does it establish with other documents that we don't apparently talk about? We could bring along many cases, but I will talk about 3. I had the honor of coordinating a book called Del Hilo al Ovillo with a subtitle, Power and Resistance of Archives or Documents. These are some cases where apparently innocent or insignificant documents have a lot of power. One is the NAFTA invoices of Santa Fe, and we found a list of the cars that were carrying gasoline, and an appraisal committee would think they would just, need to eliminate all these. So the Guatemala mayor, Manuel Colom, who was assassinated, there was the doubt of who had done this, but there was the mayor of Guatemala. And after 15 years, or 15 years later, or after his death, one of the people who were there, or who was there in the police, remembered that Manuel Colom had been reporting being followed by a motorbike 12 or 15 times, and the police had said that that was not up to them. Maybe their private lives was not, his private life was not as innocent as he thought. And 15 years later, when the file is open, there's a list of motorbikes and cars loaded with gas. So what was the license plate of the motorbike? And there you could see the motorbike of the police. So behind an innocent gas invoice or bill, they could identify the person who was driving or riding the motorbike. And this came down the line of this surgeon, coroner, investigator in the police, just because of a gas bill. In the case of Santa Fe is quite similar. When the archive of the police is reached, Laura Brincon, they become organized, and they wondered why cars were always going to fill their tanks in Santa Fe to 3 specific gas stations. And they start to geolocate this, and thanks to that, they found those places where there was a person put in a place and tortured. And just because of these petrol bills, they found the places where they went to, these 3 petrol stations, torture stations, and whenever they went in or came out, they were filling up the tanks. This is a study of a colleague, Graciela Carapapiquen Desmayo, that's her study, and she explains that a pilot of the military army in Argentina starts to feel dizzy, and he has to be replaced because he just becomes unconscious, and he is detected, a disease is detected because of the flights he was doing. We were told to not talk about the names and surnames of the pilot. Starts by A. And there is a colonel coming along with him, and when the doctor asks him, why do you have these blackouts, traumatic blackouts? And he said, well, because he's flying with open doors in his plane. And he said, yes, because Commander such and such is an airplane pilot, and he has skydivers with him. And he looks at the flight registry of this man, and he finds that he's never been flying with skydivers, and he's interrogated, and he confessed that they were death flights. So they were just flying with people, opened the doors and threw the people out in the air. And we knew about the death flights and had heard about them, but the fact that we have a clear documentation is there was a medical record of a pilot who had blackouts, and this was related to cause effect related to lie, because he was not actually flying with skydivers. He was flying with people who were thrown out of the plane. And also the case of all people that were in intern camps of Republicans who'd lost the war, and they were working there for free in order to pay for the punishment they had. So in the account court, they thought about some lists that included the names and the surnames and the cost of the maintenance of such and such person. So all the per diems, 3 pesetas, for instance, and for 3 years, we could see the same name. A document generated with financial aims made the documentation of this intern camp in Girona, constructing or building bridges and roads. So this was a document that it could have gone to a classical appraisal committee and they would have eliminated it. But these 3 samples are very good to say that there's no insignificant documents in principle or innocent documents. We should have the capacity to put them in context, and when we appraise, let's not very quickly think in eliminating or doing fast analysis and just wanting to do away with all the documents. Another thing is the email. Now it is a document for evidence. This is the case of the study of the National Security Archive on the corrupt environment of Ronald Reagan and George Bush, with these emails talking about the 5 million that they had sent to the Cayman Islands and the businesses they had with the war and the post-war business. And despite the fact that they were told that they had to eliminate these documents, they didn't want to. And finally, this photograph that I was able to use thanks to Mikkel Mahausen of the fund. This is the visit of Heinrich Himmler to Mauthausen in April 1941. The author of the photo is Paul Ricken, and this is the typical photograph that we could use this one or any other one, but this catches our attention because it's not very well known, and everyone was going with them when they arrived. And in the Nuremberg trials, everyone was denying having been to Mauthausen or anywhere. But here, everyone wanted to be in the photo because, hey, I mean, this was... Alfonso Guerra spoke about this, a socialist politician, and Alfonso Guerra was the true face of this all. And once, in order to explain that he didn't want to see treason and everyone had to be supporting the party, he said, "Those who move will not be in the photo." So that's what he said. So same thing with this one. Everyone wanted to be in the photo because they wanted to show their adhesion to the party. And of course, this is all limited to the elite. The archive as a literary and cinematographic object. And this explains how we're seen from literature and film and the stereotypes and distortions that predominate. With Rocío Ponce, we did research of this and we read over 100 books. We looked at lots of films, and unfortunately, the image is not too good. Why? Because, well, in fiction, they are interested in fiction, they're interested in unorganized archives where the protagonist finds the document by intuition. They go into a room at night and they go through the shelves and suddenly they find it. The most emblematic example of the fact that unorganized archives are not interesting is Don Brown, Called by Angels and Demons, where he explains that the Vatican Archive has the Biblion, which is a database, which is an automated database. And instead of going to Biblion and looking for the archive, he just goes into the archive and runs along the different shelves, and he's left alone, and the air conditioning system starts to fail and he starts to black out, and finally in the last minute he's saved with the document in his hand. I mean, he could have just gone to Biblion, couldn't he? So that is what they could have done. So I wrote to Dan Brown and I said, "Dear Dan Brown, this is a person writing who is an archivist, and I've read your book from this, reading it from this perspective. Why are you saying that there is a fabulous catalog and you make your protagonist do all these things?" And he answered me. He replied and he said, "Dear sir, I want to congratulate you on your vision. You are absolutely right. The editor actually told me off because of this. And you are absolutely right. I could write another version of this and then I'll make it right." This is what he said. So it is interesting that the archive is not organized. Otherwise, what's the emotion there? If you just say, good morning, I want this document. Okay, here you are. There's no emotion in that, no action. 80% of the books, there's night, there's loneliness, there's dust, and also documents of an exceptional value that hide secrets for humanity. So Bibles, whatever you want. And the drawings of professionals. And in the 80s and 90s, we start seeing archive books with a professional, find everything organized, and it's just, we never seem to have been studying archive science or anything. We're lonely all the time and we are quite peculiar, but we're very wise, and everyone says that. So I would just talk about these. 1984, George Orwell is a classic. José Saramago, All the Names, about life and death, or Rosa Montero, Lágrimas en la lluvia, which is a dystopic novel about a future where there's some places where you can breathe fresh air, and the Central Archive of the World is where you can find all the information. You have to pay to go there, and it's not too good an idea to be able to look at all the archives. In these cases, we're talking about plots where documents are protagonists, and we need to, well, they're all labyrinths, of course, and they're depots, and it's never normal. The archive is normally a hiding place that protects the document. There's many of these. And there's also the case of the owner of a shipyard, and he hires a manager so that he can lift up the company, which is collapsing, and he said, well, this is unrecoverable. And the other one says, well, yes, it is unrecoverable, but before I can recover the company, I first need to know the story, the actual story of the company. And this is something that is used in the face of recovering a company. For instance, there's always fires, there's always water, floodings from Umberto Eco, famine basically, preserving is the exception, and archives in the cinema and dystopic contexts, Blade Runner, Fahrenheit. Sergio Gavilante actually wrote on this topic, how archives are analyzed and seen in these contexts of future. So we could talk about this for hours and hours, but these reflect all these roles and create new perceptions. So the book shows us how we are seen and the things that we should change. It is unavoidable that Dan Brown wants to do what he does, of course. The microfilm, they find the microfilms in less than a minute and huge archives, and I mean, that's cinema, that's the film. Carlo Fuentes with La Silla del Águila, this is a very interesting one for me. It's one of the best because there's two, this is in Mexico, and Mr. Prim comes back and two candidates fight, and those who are in power or friends with people in power are the ones winning over. And it's all based on some documents and some phone calls. And one says to the other, you have to withdraw from this election, and I have the evidence of some corruption, a document of the past that will, or I will use to have a good future. And finally, the novel ends with them being friends. So anyway, El Llibre de les Mosques is also a very good one. It has not been translated. Or María Dueñas, she's written many. La Templanza, Misión Olvido. María Dueñas, yes, very professional. And the archive is organized. There's an inventory. They have studied. And María Dueñas really does it really well. And finally, and this is the end of it, archive as the result of recreation and reconstruction processes. I don't have a lot of time, but there's the necessity to redefine the concepts of archive, document, principle of provenance, and a series of elements that used to be very much linked to the traditional archive science or the orthodox view, and nowadays it is a suit that is too tight when we want to read community archives and social archives, etc., etc. And there's another part of the debate, which is the materials that are susceptibly not belonging to archives. Mr. Duran y Sampere had some collections that are fabulous collections, and they have all the catalogs of the Liceo or obituaries. I don't know whether there is as archiving or not, but it's material as well. So this perspective on what is a document also varies, and this impact it has on community documents. Secondly, all these documents that offer one reality, 1984, and the communist regime of Gemelieres Rojos in Cambodia, and the rewriting of history and the documentation of massacre. As José Antonio Luis Quintana says, documents that have been created to do wrong, and you have the boomerang effect. You create the document in order to massacre a minority, and when you recover the document, it is totally against you. And this is evidence of crimes against humanity, of war crimes. I don't have time, but it would be good to do a simultaneous reading of 1884 of Orwell and rewriting of history, and the case of the Red Jamers, which is writing what it needs to be written. And now I'm going to show you the drawings. There's the case of Barcelona, the reconstructed past, and these are documents that theoretically are not the classical archive document, but help to explain the landscape of Barcelona back then. what we would call the reconstructed past. Some of you these days are coming from abroad, and you may have gone to the Gothical district, the cathedral, etc. That's a recreation, an absolute recreation, of course. That is a manipulation according to standards of the pre-existing buildings and their transformation in Gothic elements and buildings. We have to make the city look like more Gothic, not too much Roman, more Gothic. And Gothic is very shiny, we have to have a Gothic city. And as background of this operation, there's the cultural renaissance, recovery of culture, of language and political nationalism of the 19th century and jumping on to the 20th century. We wanted to give you examples with some photography because it's a passionate thing for us, how we can have recreation and reconstruction of history. And this is a drawing of Barcelona. This is a humorous journal. This is Barcelona. How can I have this, such a dirty dress? I need to dress better as a city. And the opening of Via Laietana. This was a historical district with labyrinthine streets, and it was opened up like, well, they wanted to have this London-like city.
This is Joan Rubio y Balbe project, Tabermons Barcelonensis, in the city center, you know, building a recreated city. This is only a project. And here is the development of the Gothic district. In another picture, we see a tourist asking, excuse me, where is the Gothic district? And they go like, oh, this thing they are building here. And it's true. It was in the process of being built, right? See this guy here in the door with cars driving around, and this guy disguised in medieval man. And this is criticism. Why this damn Gothic neighborhood to reestablish? Inquisition. This is brutal. This is Barcelona's cathedral. Look at how it was and how it is today. Horrible. In 25 years, a quite severe transformation. Many people have not seen the initial picture. At the end of the 19th century, it was miserable. Look at this horrible cathedral. And then, you know, up we go with a Gothic style. And this is top. Yesterday with Jose Luis, we walked down this bridge. After Sagrada Familia and the Barça Museum, this is the most, the element that tourists take most pictures of. And, you know, they look so happy that I don't want to frustrate them and tell them that this was built in 1928, in order to unite the two buildings of the Barcelona City Council that later became the Catalan government. And today everyone is taking pictures, thinking that this is true Gothic style. This is Joan Rubio's style, and you know, he was amazing, he succeeded. And one last example, Clariana Paralla's house in Mercaderes Street. There was a very lovely house, and it was transferred. Francesc Cambó transferred it somewhere else. Francesc Cambó, a very reputed man with an incredible biography. I've read it, it's quite long, very interesting. And he transferred the house, and he thought, you know, considering that here there were Roman ruins, they built it on top. And they said, oh, what a coincidence, there's the museum and the Roman ruins behind. No, it's not by chance. It was planned. What a lucky coincidence. Well, this is it from my side. I know it was, I was super quick. I just wanted to share this whole idea of archives being polyhedric. My apologies to the translators. Probably it was a difficult task for them. It was indeed.